Amen. Well, what a blessing God has given us and been, huh? So grateful for the way Ben has ministered to our hearts this morning through song, and I hope that it's brought a good and fitting conclusion to the way that you've thought over the last 4 weeks about this book of Habakkuk that was written a long time ago, between 609 and 605 BC, and it seems like a book that is so distant and far away when you first open the pages and say, this is a long ways from us. But then you get into this book and you realize that it seems like it was written just yesterday. It feels like it was for us. And so today we're going to finish this study of Habakkuk by looking at all of chapter 3 that I read to you a few moments ago. And then next week we're going to start a new series in the book of Colossians. And I want to ask you to read the book of Colossians in its entirety in one sitting every day this week. Now, it's not going to take you long, and you just need to sit down and just read it and don't try to figure it out. Just let it just immerse yourself in it. Just have the words of it just kind of running through your mind, so when you come next week, you're fully prepared and ready to go, Lord willing, as we dive into that study that's going to take us through the rest of the year. Habakkuk has been a great study for us as a church because Habakkuk, as I said, was written in a time, a long time ago, in which violence and injustice and iniquity and evil and wrongdoing and lawlessness and the prevalence of unrighteous people seeming to have their way in every moment ruled over every part of the society that Habakkuk was living in. And what lies on the horizon for Habakkuk is even more trouble that's to come as the Babylonians are going to come in and conquer God's people, Judah. And this is a really tough time for Habakkuk to live in as a person who's crying out to God and saying, God, why aren't you listening to me? I feel like you're not hearing me. And his first complaint to God in the beginning of the book is that, God, you just seem to not do anything. You're not even paying any attention. And then God responds to Habakkuk, and when he does, that becomes even more confusing, because then Habakkuk says, man, before I was thinking you weren't listening and doing anything, and now that I know you're listening and now that I know what you're doing, I don't know that I like that, and I'm more confused. And so Habakkuk is really focused on the circumstances, and he's really nervous and frightened, as you would expect one would be, understanding that God was going to punish the sins of his nation. And so Habakkuk has to step back and focus on God, and he has to wrestle with why it is that God would use a more evil nation than Judah to come in and punish them. And he has to focus on what he knows to be true about God in light of all that he doesn't understand about what's happening. And God gives him a song to sing that we looked at last week in chapter 2, this taunting song that he can sing to remind himself that God will prevail, and he can remind the nations that they will not prevail in their wickedness. God will prevail. And now we come to this final chapter in Habakkuk, and we see that there has been a radical transformation in Habakkuk's heart. He has come a long ways from where he started at the beginning of this book, only 2 chapters before this song that we come to in chapter 3. He's come to understand that the righteous must live by their faith and their faithfulness in God. This final chapter reads like a psalm. I want you to look at the first verse, and I want you to see how much like a psalm this is, and it begins with a superscription, which is a way of explaining what this song is about, who it was for. This appears in a lot of psalms in our Bible. It says, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet according to Shigionoth. Now, I know you're wondering what Shigionoth means, and I have no idea. Shigionoth is a word that is transliterated directly from Hebrew. It only appears one other place really in the entire Old Testament, and most scholars just simply say that it probably has something to do with the music itself. So it tells us something about the music, maybe the melody or the way you were supposed to dance when you hear it, who knows? But that's basically what we know about it, is it has something to do with the music. But outside of that, I have no idea. So if you are accustomed to Shigionoth as a style of music, just let us all know afterwards. We'll tell the entire scholarly world. But there's another piece to this that we find that is just like a psalm. Look at verse 3. You see the word Selah that's in there, and then you see it again in verse 9 and verse 13. That's another word that appears throughout the Psalms in our book of Psalms. And like Shigionoth, we kind of also don't know what that really means either. That also, though, is something that we're pretty certain has something to do with the music. So all of this is musical, but basically it just tells us that at certain points along the way, it seems as if there was an indication that maybe you were supposed to pause and just reflect a little bit. So maybe as the music was being played, they just stopped for a moment and they paused, or maybe it signaled a new place. In some Bibles, they don't even translate the word over as Selah. They just leave it because it's a musical note and you're not supposed to stop and read it. You're just supposed to keep going. Then also in verse 19, you notice it says, to the choir master with stringed instruments. Well, that means that this prayer of Habakkuk was meant to be sung, and it was meant to be sung in the temple, and the choir master was going to lead it, and it was going to be accompanied by certain types of musical instruments. Now, when we come to this, we recognize that this is a prayer that is sung, and verse 2 contains the only petition in the prayer. He's going to ask God for something in verse 2, but the whole rest of it is still a prayer. And I think that's important because I think we have to remember that prayer is far more than us asking God for things. Prayer is made up of our adoring God for who He is, for proclaiming to Him, God, you are wise and powerful, and I trust you. It's placing our confidence in Him. Prayer is also made up of our confession of who we are in the midst of our knowledge of who God is. We are sinners in need of His grace. It carries with it this idea of thankfulness throughout the psalm. And this is just like in real life when we pray, we have to thank God for the blessings that He gives us and for who He is. And then also, we ask Him for things. But to think that asking for things is the only thing that prayer is about is wrong. It's about so much more. And this psalm is a picture-perfect example of what prayer looks like. It carries with it so many elements beyond just asking. But the first verse that we come to in verse 2 is him asking God for something. And look at what he says to God. He says, "O Lord, I have heard the report of you and your work. And O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy." Now that verse can be a little confusing for us if we don't know what it means by in the midst of the years and revive what. So the NIV makes it a little bit clearer. I want to read it. It says, "Lord, I have heard of your fame and I stand in awe of your deeds, Lord. Repeat them, repeat your deeds in our day, in our time. Make them known. In wrath, remember mercy." What Habakkuk is saying is, God, I've heard about the great things that you've done in the past. And specifically, this psalm is going to tell us about the greatness of God and His saving acts throughout the Exodus. And so he's saying, God, I want you now to do what I've heard that you did in the past. In the past, I heard of your greatness during the Exodus when you delivered your people from a foreign regime that was ruling over them and keeping them enslaved, and you brought them out from Egypt and brought them into the promised land. And now you're telling us that a foreign power is going to come and they're going to drag us away into slavery again. We're going to need you to repeat the works of the past, God. What you did then, I'm going to need you to do it again in my day. And so he says, God, please, would you do this? Psalm 44:1 says, "Oh God, we have heard with our ears. Our fathers have told us what deeds you performed in their days, in the days of old." Just like you see in the Psalms when they tell of God's mighty power in the Exodus, Habakkuk is now voicing his own psalm. Oh God, please do it again. I stand in awe of your deeds. Habakkuk has heard that God is going to bring the Babylonians and they're going to punish and they're going to judge his people. And Habakkuk says, when I first heard you describe that, it made me terrified. But then the more that I heard about you and your power, and the more that I remembered what our fathers have said about you and your power, suddenly I realized I'm not in awe of the Babylonians and their power. I'm in awe of you. It's you that I fear, God. And so, Lord, please revive this. He makes two requests. Look, God, revive your work. I want you to do what you did in the days of Moses in my day. And the second thing he asks for, God, in your wrath, remember mercy. Isn't that a bit ironic? Because the book began with Habakkuk saying to God, hey God, Why don't you do something about all these bad people? The book began with Habakkuk saying, God, I'm tired of seeing all this wickedness and this evil. I'd like you to do something about it. And now God says, well, I'm going to do something about it. I'm bringing the Babylonians in. He says, wait a minute, the Babylonians, they show no mercy. I understand you're going to pour out your wrath on your people, God, but the Babylonians, they don't show mercy when they come. Suddenly Habakkuk realizes that his life is in the hands of God. God, in your wrath, I can only ask you to remember mercy. There's going to be no reasoning with the Babylonians when they come. And now he's going to go on in verses 3 through 15, and he's going to recount all of God's faithfulness to his people throughout the Exodus. And he's going to do this in the language of a theophany. A theophany tells about God when he appears in the middle of history with great glory and great power for the deliverance and the might of his people. Look at what it says in verse number 3. God, you came from Teman. That's a city that's in Edom, south of the Dead Sea. And he says, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. That's the wilderness south of the land of Canaan. And basically what Habakkuk is doing is he's setting the stage, and he's saying, this was the stage of the Exodus, and this was the stage in which you led your people into the promised land. And so I'm setting the scene just like you showed up on that stage in that day. Lord, here's the stage we stand on, and I need you to do the same thing you did then. And what did he do? Look at what he says in the very first two words. God came. God, you came. Just pause and consider those words. That's what he says. Selah. Stop, reflect, think, pause. God came. This is not the God of deism who is far removed. This isn't the watchmaker God who creates the watch and winds it up and then pushes it aside and lets it go. This is the God who is involved in all the movements of the watch. This is not the God who is somewhere passive and far removed, indifferent to the sufferings of his people. This is the God who, when he sees his people in their suffering, he comes from eternity and he breaks into time and he moves with great power in the defense of his people. God, I need you to come. This is the God of the Exodus. It's the God of the incarnation. This is the God who's seen his people in their suffering, seen them in their plight, seen them under the bondage of Satan because of their own willful disobedience against him and sin, said, I will not leave you in this state. He comes in the person of Jesus. In him, the fullness of deity was pleased to dwell in bodily form, Colossians says. This is who he is. He's coming. He's coming for them. Verse number 3 picks up right where it leaves off, and he says, listen, you, God, you came in splendor, and you covered the heavens, and the earth, it was full of your praise. His brightness was like the light. Rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. Habakkuk is drawing a comparison from something within nature to try to describe this. He says, I don't know how to describe the brilliant glory of God, the brightness of his glory. I don't know how to describe his power, which we can't even fathom or behold. It would be destructive if it was let loose. I can describe it like the sun. Again, I think the NIV is helpful when it says his splendor was like the sunrise. When you look at the sun, it's fascinating that the sun begins to rise in the sky, and you speak of the beauty of the sunrise in the morning because you can see the beauty of the sunrise. You can see the pastel colors in the sky. As you drive, you look out your window, and what do you see on the horizon? You see purple and pink and orange hues that light up the sky, and it's magnificent and it's beautiful and it's glorious, and you see it. But once the sun breaks over the horizon, you can't look at the sun directly. To look at the sun directly would lead to blindness. And so your body, in a natural response, turns away. Reaction takes over. No matter how hard you might tell yourself, look at the sun, you can't do it. Your body responds. Bam, you look away. You say, I can't look. It blinds me. Why? Because that sun is radiant in glory with a blinding effect upon us if we were to stare into it. Just like God in his radiant glory cannot be looked upon. When Moses was on Mount Sinai with God, all he could do was look at the afterglow of God as he marched past in a moment in which Moses was placed in the cleft of the rock, able to catch just a glimpse, but not to see much more than that. Just like you, when the sun sets, can look and you can see the after effect of the sun, but you can't look at it. This is his power, and it's veiled. And it is a power because apart from just the splendorous beauty of the sun, the world would be left in trouble if there were no sun. The planet would freeze, life would die, it'd be over. The sun brings power that sustains. And God, well, God, you're like the sun. You're beautiful. You're glorious. I can't look at you in the eyes. It would be blinding. If you didn't veil your power, Lord, we would be decimated. But you let just enough of your power loose on the earth to keep us alive, to sustain us. He says in verse 5, before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. Pestilence and plague often follow war. In many wars throughout the centuries, it's been true that many more people have died of pestilence in the camp, illness, sickness in the camp, than have died from the actual arrows and spears and swords. Because dysentery breaks loose in a primitive camp, in a war, you find that people just die left and right because they have no access to any good medicine. Here, Habakkuk says, God, when you appear, and it's as if pestilence and plague, well, they just come alongside of you as if they're your attendants. In fact, it says that plague follows at his heels. It's like an attack dog that's just following along beside you, waiting for you to say, attack, and the dog goes and it attacks. God, when you came in the Exodus, you came to Egypt, and here we were in Egypt, and we were under bondage by the most powerful army the world had ever known. And we were a people who didn't possess the power to overthrow that army. But when the story was all told, it wasn't Israel's army versus Pharaoh's army. It was that Pharaoh's army failed to succeed because the power of God over the forces of nature were such that if God wanted the river to turn to blood, it would. If he wanted frogs to overtake the land, they would. If he wanted locusts to destroy the crops, they would. If he wanted the sun to go dark, it would. If he wanted hail to rain down upon the people, it would. If he wanted the firstborn of every child dead, it would be. God controls the forces of nature, and that means that when he moves, when he comes and no one stands against him. His power is absolute over his creation. Understand that. God's power is absolute over his creation. Verse 6, he stood and he measured the earth. He looked and he shook the nations. The image is that Israel is in trouble and God is on his throne in heaven. And the nations are getting away with whatever it is they want to get away with. All the wicked and evil that you can imagine is running free throughout the world until God stands. And when God stands, it all comes to a stop. He stands and he surveys the situation. He looks, and what does he see? He sees the world in desperate need, and he intervenes. And when he stands, he shakes the nations. These nations like Babylon that are shaking the people suddenly find that they are the ones being shaken. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills, they sank low. His were the everlasting ways. The mountains, well, to Israel, the mountains seemed eternal. The mountains withstood everything. The mountains were the most unshakable thing on planet Earth. In fact, the mountains withstood the fury of the flood when everything was destroyed. Everything except the mountains faded away. But God, when God comes, even the mountains won't survive. The mountains won't survive because the mountains are not eternal. God is eternal. God stands and the mountains shake. I saw the tents of Cushan, verse 7, in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. These were just two tribes that were on either side of the Red Sea. And he's saying when God came in power and marched his people right through the Red Sea, the tribes that were all around the sea saw and heard of the great power of Israel's God, Yahweh, and they said, oh, please do not let his gaze fall upon us. They wanted nothing to do with this dreadful power. So Habakkuk asks a series of questions. Verse 8, was your wrath against the rivers? Was your anger against the rivers, or your indignation against the sea? When you rode on your horses, on your chariot of salvation? Habakkuk is saying, God, let me ask you about the motive in your coming. You didn't come because you were mad at the rivers. You didn't turn the river into blood because you were mad at the river. You didn't split the sea in half because you were mad at the sea. In fact, God, when you turned the river into blood, it was not an act of judgment against the river. It was an act of judgment against Egypt, and you used the forces of nature to overcome your people's enemies. You stopped the Jordan River when it was time for your people to cross the Jordan and come into the Promised Land. You said the moment the priest's foot touches the water and they're carrying the ark, instantly the river must come to a stop. When his people came to the edge of the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army bear down upon him, God said to the sea, open, and the sea opened, and they went through, and the sea collapsed, and Pharaoh was gone. You begin to see God has absolute power over everything. Everything. Verse 9, you stripped the sheath from your bow, calling for many arrows. See, this is an interesting statement. This Hebrew phrase here actually has been translated literally about 100 different ways into English. And there's a reason for that. It's a phrase that there are so many words that you're trying to get at what's going on, and these words can be interchanged in a different number of ways. And basically what it's communicating is this. God is like Legolas from Lord of the Rings. He has a bow, and when he's ready, he will take that bow out. And when he pulls the bow out, then he will pull his arrows. And when he fires the arrows, these very arrows, as some translations say, have sworn an oath to God. The arrows are sworn in, and when he calls them like a soldier who has taken an oath, the arrows must come running and obey him. They must report for duty. God controls all the arrows that have ever flown on the earth. Listen, if you think that there's ever been a moment in history when any arrow ever flew through the air searching for its target, not under the control of God, then you have not yet reconciled God's power with your view of him. Understand that every moment you've ever witnessed in every epic movie of the past where hundreds and thousands of men have taken arrows and they have lit them on fire and let them fly, when thousands of arrows coming in two different directions at one time are mid-flight, God is controlling their destiny right down to the millimeter in which they will land in. Because the arrows must give their allegiance to God, like every other force in nature. God is sovereign. He is in control. And Habakkuk says here, Selah. And if he means what we might think he means, you probably really should stop and consider this. The continuation of this theophany is in verse 9. He says, you split the earth with rivers. I mean, God, he has absolute power over nature. When it says he split the earth with rivers, he means when God wanted to shape the landscape of the earth, he just sent the direction of rivers in certain ways. If you've ever been to the Grand Canyon or to the Royal Gorge or to the Black Canyon of the Gunnison, and you've stood and you've looked at these things and you've listened to a park ranger describe how a river over millions of years formed this canyon or this gorge by shaping the flow of the river, by the river's flow, it shaped the pattern of the rocks and it shaped the ravine. Listen, there's a simple answer for all of your questions as to how a river can do something like that, and the answer is that God told it to. When God says to the Grand Canyon, I'd like you to exist, and I'd like a river to be at the bottom of it, it's simply there because that's the way God intended it to be. Rivers obey him. Rocks obey him. Canyons are formed because of the power of his word. Rock formations exist in caves, in stalactite and stalagmite fashion because of the power of his authoritative word. God is powerful over his creation. And he uses the rivers. And it says that the mountains, when they saw God, they writhed. Writhed is a word that is used throughout the Old Testament to describe a woman in child labor. This is a woman who's giving birth. The mountains, when they see God, they don't think of themselves as a formidable force. Instead, they writhe like a woman giving birth to a child. The raging waters, well, they just swept on. No water decided that it would dare ask if it was okay for it to stop and pause for a while. It just keeps on going and destroying with destructive force when God tells it to. The deep, it gives forth its voice. That means that the chaos of the sea, it must respond in absolute obedience to what God asks it to do. And furthermore, the sea, well, it lifts its hands on high. That means that when God demands of the waves, the hands of the sea, that they be lifted, well, they are lifted. And when he demands that they crash down, they crash down. If that means that they are to be lifted as his people pass through, then those hands of the sea will not dare fall. And when he says that it is time for those hands to crash down upon his enemies, they will come with a thunderous fist upon them. This is the power of God over nature. The sun and the moon, they stood still in their place. At the light of your arrows as they sped, at the flash of your glittering spear. This is God showing his power in Joshua chapter 10 when Israel finally arrives and they're ready to take over the land. And as they're entering into the land during the midst of the conquest, they come up against the Amorites, and the Amorites are powerful. And what does Joshua do? Well, Joshua says to the sun, "Could you stand still while we fight this battle?" And the sun stands still. In Joshua 10, the sun stands still in the sky. Now, you and I both know that the sun doesn't stand still because the sun is in the middle of the solar system. It is still. We're revolving around the sun. So, when he says that the sun stands still, that means that the earth just stops rotating. Now, some of you are having a hard time with that, and you're saying, if the earth stopped rotating, how would we stand here? What would happen with gravity? Is that possible? Could that? Listen, here's how it works. If God wants the sun to stand still in the sky as you look up at it by making the earth stop rotating, then that's what he does. You say, but the laws of nature, listen, I forgot to tell you. The laws of nature, they have a higher authority. He is the sovereign God of heaven and earth. If God wants the sun to stand still in the sky by causing the earth to stop rotating, don't worry about what happens to all the people here. Just understand that the point is that you need to worship the God who at his very utterance can stop the earth from spinning. You have to begin to see the power of God over his creation. Understand the power of God over his creation. Do not put your faith in anything other than God. The righteous will live by their faith. Verse 12, you march through the earth in fury. He was like a thundering giant marching through the earth, threshing the nations in anger. This is a picture of an ox that's treading grain, and it's crushing the nations like the ox crushes the grain. Why would God crush the nations? Here's why, verse 13. Because you went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. God shows up and he uses all of his power over the rivers and the seas and the sun and the arrows, and he does it all for the deliverance of his people. All of his power, all of his authority commanded in one direction, the deliverance of his people. Do you understand that if God directs all of his power and his authority in your direction for your deliverance, nothing can withstand his power? Nothing. For us to walk through this world as if we are limping through history is to fail to remember that while we may limp through history, God stands towered above it. Lord, you crushed the head of the house of the wicked. You laid them bare from thigh to neck. It was a mortal blow. They weren't going to recover from it. And so stop and think about that. Selah. You have absolute power over everything. And it's all under your control, and you come for your people. You pierced our enemy, you pierced him with his own arrows. The heads of his warriors, they came like a whirlwind to scatter us. They were going to rejoice like they were devouring the poor in secret. This is a picture of like the Jewish people hiding in walls as the Nazis come in and devour them. They find them hiding in secret and they drag them out and they rejoice over their slaughter, except for this time. Well, this time they came for God's people, and when they came for God's people, somehow the people that were rejoicing over their power over these poor, pitiful people began to, in a frantic fit of rage, shoot each other. He said, why would they do that? Well, I already told you, God's in control of the arrows. Their allegiance is to Him. The arrows belong to God. And so He marched through the earth, destroying those who were marching through the earth, destroying. Verse 15, you trampled the sea with your horses, the surging of mighty waters. There's one final moment to remember. Just remember, this symbol of the sea is the ultimate chaos of the earth, and you trampled over it. I mean, Lord, Pharaoh was on a chariot bearing down upon your people, and you were riding your own chariot. And the sea obeyed. God is not indifferent. God is not inactive. Habakkuk has remembered that God is intimately involved with his people's lives. He's looked to the past. His heart has been transformed, and now he looks into the future. And when he looks in the future, look at what he says. He says in verse 16, I hear, in my body will it trembles, my lips they quiver at the sound, rottenness enters into my bones, my legs tremble beneath me. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. Habakkuk's encounter with God, it left him shaken. In the beginning, he said, wait a minute, God, I'm trembling over what you're telling me is going to happen. But then suddenly, it didn't just leave him shaken, it left him calm. He said, wait a minute, if I rightly understand you, I don't have to shake before them. I don't stand in awe of them. I don't fear them. I stand in awe of you, God. I fear you alone. And so his encounter suddenly has left him incredibly calm. He knows one day God will repeat the works of the past. He knows God's wrath will be poured out. And he also knows that God will be merciful to his people. Habakkuk's calm, though, we would make a real mistake if we assumed that it was a form of denial. Habakkuk hasn't buried his head in the sand. Habakkuk has not said, I don't think any of this is really going to happen. I'm just going to live with wishful thinking that the Babylonians aren't really coming and none of this is actually going to happen. Rather, he's absolutely certain the Babylonians are coming. Why? Because God has told him they're coming. And because God has told him he's coming, he's absolutely certain they're coming, but he's also heard God say that he will deliver his people ultimately, which means that he's equally as certain that this is going to happen, which means that he can face what's coming with a whole different disposition than he could before. And so look at what happens, verse 17. Though the fig tree should not blossom, that's what's going to happen. The fig tree, when the Babylonians come, the fig tree is going to be ruined. Nor fruit be on the vines, or the produce of the olive fields, or fail, and the fields yield no blood. The flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. This is a description of absolute economic ruin. When the Babylonians come in, when the foreigners invade, there's going to be absolute economic ruin. It's going to lead to devastation and famine. And yet, when that happens, what does he say? He says, in spite of all that, verse 18, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. Yet, even though all this is going to happen, I'm going to rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. Habakkuk doesn't say he's going to gut it out. He doesn't say he's going to grit his teeth and bear it. He says, when this happens, my joy is not going to be shaken. This is a man who's saying, I'm looking in the future and I see economic ruin in my future. And yet what I see in my future is joy. I'm looking at my future and what I see in my future is a foreign invasion. And yet, you know what I see in my future? I see joy. I look in my future and I see total devastation. And yet I see joy. How do you see joy? Because I take my joy in the God of my salvation. You see, Habakkuk's joy is not found in his circumstances. It's found in the Lord. Habakkuk's saying, God, you're the one who saves. So my joy must be anchored to you. My life must be anchored to you. Verse 19, God, the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. The sovereign Lord is the strength of Habakkuk. And because of that, Habakkuk's confidence is in him, and it's not shaken to the degree that he can say, you know, when you see a mountain deer and it's running up the side of a mountain on the most unstable of terrain, and as the deer climbs further up the mountain, rocks are falling down, and if anyone's standing below, the rocks are falling upon the people, but the deer is scurrying up, and it's like he's just standing on very solid ground, even though it's crumbling underneath him. Well, God, well, that's how you make me. Even though my world may crumble beneath me, I will be sure-footed. Because you, God, you're my foundation. You are my sure footing. And so the world may crumble beneath me, but you will not crumble. Church, if we cannot, as the people of God, stare into the face of our future and say with confidence, I will not crumble, then we have not understood the power of God. It's not about you understanding faith. It's about you. You don't increase your faith by walking around with a mantra all day. Believe, 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 believe. I've been telling myself to believe all day. Stop telling yourself to believe all day. Start telling yourself how mighty God is. Look into the future and say, the future in front of me, it's dark and I can't see it. And I don't know what's there, but I can tell you one thing I do know about my future. I'm not going to crumble. You say, how do you know you're not going to crumble? That sounds very arrogant. No, it's not arrogant at all. In fact, if I were to have any thoughts that I would be able to withstand the future, then I would tell you that not only would I crumble, I would dissolve and disintegrate and be gone and lost forever, but the future is not one that I'm in charge of. The future is one that I'm going to step into on the sure foundation of God being the God that He has revealed Himself to be. I will not crumble in the future. Church, the days ahead for the people of God are not to be marked with ease and comfort in which we can always find sure footing where we stand. They're going to be confusing days. They're going to be days in which all of the earth is rattling underneath us. But we cannot crumble, church. And the only way we cannot crumble is if we remember that Jesus is building His church and the gates of hell do not prevail against it. This is what we are called to. And so Habakkuk, he's done arguing with God. He's done. There's no need for him to argue. He's done questioning God's ways. He's done wondering what God is doing. He just looks into the future and he says, you know what? I'm transformed. Something's happened in me and I'm transformed. And so if you and I want to be like Habakkuk in that regard and experience that same transformation taking place in us, it's taking place in him. And then we got to say, well, how did this happen to this guy? And then we got to do it. So I'm going to tell you three things. I think there are three things that has happened in Habakkuk that has caused him to be transformed. And I think these three things are what transforms every one of us. The first is this, just Habakkuk changed his focus. Habakkuk changed his focus. What do I mean by Habakkuk changed his focus? And let me just say, mark nothing that I'm saying up in the category of self-help. If you try to help yourself, you're going to fall with those rocks down below the deer's feet. This is not about self-help. This is about God's deliverance of His people. And Habakkuk changes his focus. Notice that the first thing that Habakkuk was doing was focusing on the wickedness of Judah. This is where his focus was on. He said, when I look around, here's what I see. Chapter 1 and verses 2 and 4. He says, I see violence, I see injustice, I see wrongdoing, I see lawlessness, I see all this terrible stuff. And that's all he could see. All he could see was all the bad things happening. I mean, he looks around and he says, I don't see anything good. I mean, in chapter 1, Habakkuk is like a cable news junkie. This is all he sees. Bad, 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 bad. And as long as he's doing that, he's mad at the world. And some of us have got to realize, like, that's us sometimes, isn't it? I mean, we just live from one 24-hour news cycle to the next, and we're just mad, 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 mad. All I see is this, all I see is that, all I see is this, all I see is this. And he just focuses on it. And then he takes it a step further. He moves from being focused on all the problems he sees to being focused on his opinion of all that God is not doing to fix all the problems. And this too is a problem for us. Suddenly he looks around and he says, God, I don't think you're doing anything about it. Remember what he said in chapter 1? He said this, he said, your eyes, they're too pure to look at evil. In fact, you can't tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? Now all he can think about is how God is just mismanaging the world. First he's focused on all the problems and he's like a cable news junkie, and then suddenly he focuses on God's mismanagement of everything, and now he's like a cable news host. Now he just looks and says, you know what, they should be doing this, and why aren't they doing that? And how about this, and what about that, and why don't they do this, and you know what, we got to this. And none of that's working. None of that's doing anything. You know what that does? That just makes him not just mad, but now he's just filled with angst. He doesn't have any peace, he doesn't have any joy. But suddenly he shifts his focus. He shifts it. He says, oh Lord, I have heard the report of you and your work. Suddenly, instead of focusing on the circumstances, he's focused on God. He says, I've heard of you. I don't have any control over this, but here's what I do know. I do know, Lord, that you are holy. I know that you are eternal, you are self-existent, you are mighty, and you are faithful. And I know, Lord, of your past work. I know of your absolute power. And I know that when you come with your absolute power to deliver your people, it's right and it's good, and you never fail. And so Habakkuk says, I got to change my focus. Suddenly he's no longer angry. He's no longer filled with angst. He has peace and joy in the midst of all that. Now here's what's amazing. In all of this, Habakkuk's circumstances have never changed. And that is so crucial to understand. Habakkuk's circumstances are the same at the end of the chapter. In fact, we could take that a step further and say, they're going to get worse. But Habakkuk is suddenly different. See, this is why you have to change your focus. And the second thing, Habakkuk doesn't just change his focus, Habakkuk changes his perspective. Now, I know you say, well, perspective and focus, isn't that kind of the same thing? No. Focus is what you're looking at. Perspective is how you see it. And he changes his perspective. How does he change his perspective? Well, his perspective in the beginning was very simplistic. Here was his perspective in the beginning. There's good people and there's bad people. There's the righteous and there's the unrighteous. And that's all he could see. And where did Habakkuk put himself? Well, Habakkuk put himself in the category of the good and the righteous. And where did he put everybody else? Well, they're the unrighteous. They're the bad people. And so God, good people like me, we're concerned about what you're doing with bad people like them. And now, suddenly, Habakkuk understands. What does he say in chapter 2, verse 20? Lord, you are in your holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. There weren't good people and bad people. There weren't the righteous and the unrighteous. There was God in his holy temple. That alone was the place of goodness and righteousness. And then there was all the earth. And all the earth was not good and righteous. In fact, the earth, well, it was defined by sinful humanity and sinful people. Sinful humanity, sinful people created sinful problems, and Habakkuk now recognizes that he's not in a different circle. God alone is in the circle of good and righteous, and Habakkuk and the rest of the earth are in the circle of those who have rebelled against God and who have been wicked and evil and unjust. And it is sin that plagues them, and it is the reason the wages of sin are death, and that everyone will die. And suddenly he sees that, and as he sees that, he has a perspective that changes, because here's what happens. The more I know God, the more I understand His holiness. And the more I know me, well, the more I understand my sinfulness. And the more I understand my sinfulness in light of God's holiness, the greater my need for grace becomes. And the greater the gap grows between me and God. You see, when I first hear that God is holy and I'm sinful, I make a foolish error in thinking that the distance between me and God can only be about this much. I mean, after all, the distance between me and God is probably like this because He's for good and I'm for good. But you know, the distance between me and, well, that bum over there, well, that's a big distance right there. And suddenly I begin to recognize who God is. Wait a minute, God is absolutely holy. And I begin to learn more of His holiness. And the more I learn of His holiness, I begin to understand more of my own sinfulness. The more I learn of my sinfulness in light of His holiness, the more I begin to see a significant gap that grows. And I say, wait a minute, we're not very close at all. And I learn that the gospel is the only means for me to find any way to be reconciled to God. And so the cross must become big in my life. It must bridge the gap between me and God. But here's what happens. The longer that I learn of God and His ways, the more that I know Him, the more that I love Him and embrace Him and worship Him, the more my vision of His holiness grows. We live in a generation plagued by this ridiculous familiarity with God where we treat Him as some common thing that we can just engage with as He's like He's just one of our buddies or something, and we don't revere Him for His holiness because He is in His holy temple and He is to be revered. There is reverence that is required of me, and the more that I know that, the more His holiness grows, and the more my sinfulness grows in my understanding of who I am in light of His holiness. And that means that the further I go in my walk with God, the more intimately I know Him, the less familiar I become with Him as if He's my buddy, and the more the need for the cross to grow in my life becomes. I'm afraid that most of us have bought into this foolish idea that the gospel is something, the cross is something that we need for the beginning of our life with Christ. It's what we need in the beginning to hear the gospel. But at some point, I need to move beyond those childish things, and I need to get into the deeper things of God. And the further that I progress in my relationship with God, the further into the background the cross begins to fade. And as I look, it's somewhere way in the past, and it's smaller and smaller and smaller in my life. And it's the reason that I don't talk about the cross, and it's the reason I don't talk about my salvation. It's the reason I don't talk about God's holiness and my sinfulness, because I see that as something that happened back then, but now I've moved on from that. No, listen, you never move on from the cross. The reason I talk about the cross all the time is because if you don't understand that as God's holiness grows in your life and as your awareness of your sinfulness grows, you will find the gap between you and God grows more and more and more and more. And the gap between you and the bum that you thought you were so far away from over there becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. And together you stand on this side, and the cross just has to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, or you'll never know God. See, we need a cross that overshadows everything in our lives. We need a cross that is large and glorious and magnificent and is reflective of the grace that is large and glorious and magnificent. Habakkuk, his perspective has changed. God is holy. Let all the earth keep silent before Him, including me. I'm done with my dumb questions. This is what Habakkuk is saying. Finally, Habakkuk changes his outlook. He looks into the future, and he changes his outlook. Not because the circumstances have changed for him, and not because having done business with God, He thinks that God is now beholden to somehow show up and change Habakkuk's future, so after all, none of it happens anyway. It's still all going to happen, just as God said. But his outlook is different. His outlook is different. Chapter 3 ends in this way, doesn't it? Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread on the heights. The strength of the sovereign Lord is now the ground that Habakkuk stands upon. He stands on it in these circumstances, and he stands on it in the future circumstances. Even if the earth crumbles beneath us, even if the earth crumbles beneath us, God is our firm foundation, and we, church, will not crumble. Lord, what a truth to simply say that your people will stand forever. And so to you, our great and glorious King, we give all of our worship and praise.